The year was 1879, and the American West remained as unforgiving as it was vast. Beneath a sky that stretched endlessly from horizon to horizon, the abandoned mining town of Silverton stood frozen in time, its weathered buildings like gravestones marking the death of someone's ambition. What most considered a ghost town, a place haunted only by broken dreams and whistling wind, had become the last desperate refuge for a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to survive was to disappear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Among these forgotten structures, Eleanor Reed had found something rare in her tumultuous life: silence. Yet even as she kept her fire small and her footsteps light, she knew the bounty hunters were closing in. Men who tracked humans with the same cold calculation used to hunt wolves. Men who wouldn't stop until they collected what they were owed. What she didn't know was that she wasn't as alone as she thought, and that the silver miner watching her campfire from the shadows carried secrets as heavy as her own. The December wind cut through Silverton like a knife, finding every crack in the abandoned buildings, every gap in the rotting wood. Eleanor huddled deeper into her tattered coat, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air of the derelict assayer's office she'd claimed as shelter. 3 days she'd been here, though time had begun to blur at the edges. 3 days of looking over her shoulder, of startling at every creak and groan of the ghost town around her. She'd once been Eleanor Reed, daughter of Judge Thomas Reed of Boston, educated at finishing school, destined for a respectable marriage and a life of quiet privilege. Now she was simply Ellie, a fugitive with a $500 bounty on her head, dead or alive. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her father had spent his career passing judgment on others, and now his daughter was the one being hunted. The small fire she'd built in what had once been a cast-iron stove provided meager warmth at best. She'd kept it small deliberately. Smoke could be seen for miles in this barren landscape. But tonight, with the temperature dropping and her supplies dwindling, she'd risked adding an extra log. A mistake, perhaps, but freezing to death seemed a poor alternative. Her gloveless fingers worked mechanically, checking the chambers of the revolver that lay heavy in her lap. 6 bullets. 6 chances, if it came to that. She hoped it wouldn't, but hope had become a luxury she could scarcely afford. The gun had belonged to Jacob, her husband, former husband, the man whose blood still haunted her dreams. She pushed the thought away. There was no room for those memories here, not when survival required every ounce of her concentration. Eleanor's stomach growled, a sharp reminder that her provisions were nearly gone. The jerky was finished yesterday, and the stale biscuits this morning. All that remained was half a canteen of water and a small pouch of coffee grounds she'd been rationing like gold dust. Tomorrow she would need to venture out, perhaps try to snare a rabbit, though her skills as a hunter were rudimentary at best. Boston society hadn't prepared her for skinning game or building fires from nothing. A sudden sound outside, the distinct crunch of boots on frozen ground, sent her heart racing. She extinguished the lantern with a quick breath, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint orange glow from the stove. The revolver was in her hand before she registered reaching for it, the weight familiar now in a way that would have horrified her former self. The footsteps paused. Eleanor held her breath, pressing herself against the wall beside the broken window. Through a gap in the wooden boards, she could see only darkness, the moonless night offering both concealment and blindness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, that peculiar heavy silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. Then the footsteps receded, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. A deer, perhaps, or some other creature seeking shelter from the cold. Or maybe, and this thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter air, It was one of Blackwell's men, scouting the ghost town before bringing in the others. Marcus Blackwell, the bounty hunter whose reputation spread through the territories like wildfire. They said he'd tracked a man through the Badlands for 17 days without rest. They said he never failed to bring in his quarry. She'd heard the stories in whispered conversations at railway stations, in the kitchens of boarding houses where she'd found brief employment before moving on. Always moving on. Eleanor checked the door's barricade, a heavy desk she'd dragged across the entrance when she'd first claimed this space. It wouldn't stop a determined man with an axe, but it might buy her precious seconds. The window was her. Escape route, the boards loose enough to pull away quickly. She'd rehearsed it in her mind countless times. The desk, the window, the dash to the abandoned mine shaft where she'd hidden her meager possessions, and the elderly mare she'd purchased with the last of her money. She was under no illusions about, outrunning professional hunters on their fresh-blooded horses. But if she could reach the mountains, lose herself in the maze of canyons she'd studied on a tattered map stolen from a station master's office 3 towns back, she might have a chance. A small one, but it was all she had. Her gaze fell on the worn satchel beside her bedroll. Inside was everything she had left in the world, a change of clothes, a small knife, a tinderbox, and the locket containing a miniature portrait of her mother, gone 7 years now. And beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth, the reason for her flight. The ledger that documented every transaction, every bribe, every name in Judge Thomas Reed's web of corruption. Her father's legacy and her damnation. She hadn't intended to take it. That night in her father's study, she'd been searching for money, something to fund her escape from Jacob's increasingly violent outbursts. Instead, she'd found the truth about the man who had raised her, whose strict moral code had shaped her childhood. The shock had frozen her in place, ledger in hand, when Jacob had burst in, reeking of whiskey and rage. What followed played in her nightmares with relentless clarity. His accusations, her desperate denials, the way he'd grabbed the ledger, threatening to use it against her father unless she agreed to stay. The struggle, the letter opener on the desk, the look of surprise in Jacob's eyes as the blade sank into his chest. She'd run then, taking only what she could carry, including the damning ledger. By morning, the authorities were calling it murder. By evening, her father had disowned her publicly and placed a bounty on her head. Whether to silence her or punish her, she wasn't certain. Perhaps both. For 3 months she'd been running, working under assumed names, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, trading her fine dresses for practical garments that wouldn't draw attention. She'd cut her hair short with shaking hands, staining the chestnut locks darker with walnut husks. The woman who stared back at her from infrequent glimpses in mirrors was a stranger, gaunt, hollow-eyed, wary in a way Eleanor Reed had never been. A sudden gust of wind rattled the boards on the window, and Eleanor flinched. Each sound was a potential threat, each shadow a hunter closing in. Sleep came in fitful bursts, consciousness always hovering just beneath the surface, ready to snap her awake at the slightest provocation. Tonight would be no different. She arranged her bedroll closer to the dying embers in the stove, keeping the revolver within reach. Her routine was mechanical now. Check the barricade, check the window, check the gun. Listen for footsteps. Plan escape routes. Calculate how long until dawn. This was no way to live, she knew. Eventually, her luck would run out, or her strength would fail, or the nightmares would consume what was left of her sanity. But tonight, at least, she was still breathing. Tonight, she was still free. As she settled into her bedroll, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the abandoned mine at the edge of town. She'd explored only the entrance, wary of rotten support beams and unstable shafts. But perhaps deeper inside there might be something useful. Tools, forgotten supplies, maybe even a map that could guide her through the mountains more effectively than her stolen one. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would explore the mine, after checking her snares for any unfortunate rabbit that might provide a meal. One more day in this ghost town, and then she would move on. She had to. Staying in one place too long was how people like her got caught. The wind howled outside, a mournful sound that seemed to echo her own desolation. Eleanor pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes, not expecting sleep, but welcoming the brief respite of darkness. She was drifting, at the edges of consciousness when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a horse nickering. Not her mare, whose soft whinnies she'd grown accustomed to. This was different, closer to the town centre than the stable where she'd hidden her own mount. Eleanor was on her feet instantly, revolver in hand. Through the gap in the boarded window, she strained to see in the darkness. Nothing moved in the main street, the dilapidated buildings standing silent sentinel in the night. But she hadn't imagined it. Someone was here. With practiced quiet, she gathered her satchel, securing it across her body. The ledger inside pressed against her side, a constant reminder of why she couldn't afford to be caught. If it was Blackwell, if he'd found her, she needed to move now, while darkness still offered some protection. The mine shaft was her best chance, a labyrinth she hoped would confuse any pursuers. She'd take her mare and head north, away from the mapped trails. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all she had. Just as she was about to remove the boards from the window, lantern light flickered in the street outside. Eleanor froze, heart hammering against her ribs. The light moved slowly, methodically, sweeping across building fronts, searching. She crouched lower, peering through the gap. A figure emerged from between two buildings, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the night. Not Blackwell, whose distinctive white duster she'd glimpsed once from a distance. This man moved differently, with a caution that spoke of respect for the abandoned town, rather than the purposeful stride of a hunter. The lantern light caught his face briefly, weathered, bearded, with eyes that seemed to absorb the darkness rather than reflect the light. He wasn't wearing a lawman's badge or carrying a rifle like most bounty hunters she'd encountered. Instead, he held something that looked like a prospector's pick in his free hand. A miner, perhaps. Someone looking to reopen one of Silverton's, played out claims, or scavenge what equipment remained in the abandoned operations. The thought brought little comfort. Any stranger was a potential threat, someone who might recognize her from the wanted posters or decide that $500 was worth betraying a lone woman. The man paused near the assayer's office, his head tilting slightly as if listening. Eleanor held her breath, fear a metallic taste on her tongue. Had he seen the smoke from her fire, noticed the subtle signs of habitation that she'd tried so carefully to conceal? He took a step toward the building, then another. The floorboards beneath Eleanor creaked as she shifted position, and she saw the man's posture change instantly, alert, tense, ready. He extinguished his lantern with a quick movement, plunging the street into darkness. Eleanor's finger tensed. On the trigger of her revolver. She didn't want to shoot, didn't want to add another death to the one that already haunted her. But she wouldn't be taken. Not alive. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved. The silence stretched taut between them, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, the man spoke. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I know you're in there. His voice was low, graveled, but lacking the menace she'd expected. I'm not looking for trouble. Eleanor remained silent, weighing her options. The window was her only escape now, and he was too close to risk it without being seen. The fire in the stove, he continued when she didn't respond. Smoke's visible against the stars, if you know what to look for. Anyone comes through here looking for someone, that's the first thing they'll notice. Still, she said, Nothing, but her mind raced. If he'd seen the smoke, others might too. Blackwell and his men could be closer than she thought. "Listen," the man said, his tone shifting slightly. "There are riders coming. 3, maybe 4. I spotted them from the ridge while I was checking my claims. They're moving purposeful, like men who know what they're after." A cold dread washed over Eleanor. Bounty hunters. They'd found her. "If you're who I think they're looking for," the stranger continued, "you don't have much time." Finally, Eleanor found her voice, though it emerged hoarse from disuse. "Why are you telling me this?" There was a pause before he answered, and when he did, something in his tone had changed, hardened. "Because I've got no love for Marcus Blackwell, or men of his kind." The name sent a fresh surge of fear through her. "So it was Blackwell after all. You know him?" she asked, still not moving from her position by the window. Another pause. "We've crossed paths." "And why should I trust you?" Eleanor demanded, though she knew her options were dwindling by the second. "You shouldn't," he replied simply. "But right now, I'm offering you a better chance than trying to outrun Blackwell's men on whatever broken-down nag you've got hidden in the livery." The accuracy of his assessment, both of her mare's condition and its location, startled her. He'd been watching her, perhaps for longer than just tonight. The thought was unsettling, but not as terrifying as the image of Blackwell's men closing in. "What are you suggesting?" she asked cautiously. "There's an old shaft behind the assayers. Office. Part of the original Silver Creek operation, before the vein played out. It connects to a network that runs under half the mountain. I've been mapping it for months. And you'd show me these tunnels out of the kindness of your heart?" Skepticism edged her words. She heard what might have been a soft, humorless laugh. "Kindness has nothing to do with it. Let's just say I owe Blackwell a debt, and helping you disappear would be a satisfying way to start paying it." Eleanor weighed her limited options. The stranger could be lying, setting a trap to claim the bounty himself. But if Blackwell really was approaching with his men, her current plan, running for the mountains on an exhausted mare, was likely to end with her capture or death before dawn. "They'll be here within the hour," the man added, urgency now evident in his voice. "Make your decision." In the distance, carried on the wind, came the faint sound that made the decision for her, the rhythmic beat of hooves against hard ground. "Multiple riders moving fast. How do I know this isn't a trap?" she asked, even as she began gathering her few possessions. "You don't," he answered bluntly. "But I know these mountains. I know where the old boundary disputes left gaps in jurisdiction, places where a bounty from Colorado territory means nothing." It was thin hope, but hope nonetheless. Eleanor made her decision. "I need to get my horse," she said, moving toward the window. "No time. They're too close, and that animal will only slow us down in the tunnels. Bring only what you can carry." She hesitated, thinking of the mare that had carried her this far. Abandoning the animal felt like a betrayal, but the man was right. A horse would be useless in mining tunnels, and trying to reach the livery now might expose them both. With quick, practiced movements, Eleanor secured her satchel and the precious ledger inside it, then checked her revolver one final time before tucking it into her belt. The stranger was right about one thing. She had survived this long by making hard choices. This was just one more. "Move the desk," the man instructed, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I'll meet you at the back door." Eleanor hesitated only a moment longer before pushing the heavy desk aside with a strength born of desperation. The door creaked as she eased it open, stepping into the bitter night air where fate awaited in the form of a stranger whose face she had barely glimpsed. The coyote howled again, closer this time, as if marking the moment when Eleanor Reed's life once again pivoted on the edge of a knife. Behind her lay the ghost town and approaching hunters. Ahead stood a man offering escape through darkness. She had no choice but to follow. The mining tunnel swallowed them whole, darkness thick as velvet closing around Eleanor as she followed the stranger deeper into the mountain. His lantern cast wild, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn walls, the light barely strong enough to illuminate the next few steps ahead. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady plink-plink that marked time in this subterranean world. "Watch your step," the miner warned, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "These support beams are older than they look, and not all of them are sound." Eleanor ducked beneath a sagging timber, acutely aware of the thousands of tons of rock suspended above them. She'd never been fond of enclosed spaces, even as a child. Now, following a man she didn't know into the bowels of a mountain while killers searched above seemed like madness. Yet here she was, trusting her life to a stranger because the alternative was worse. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, strained, thin, betraying the fear she fought to contain. "We need to put at least a mile between us and the main shaft," he replied without turning. "There's a chamber ahead where several tunnels branch off. We can rest there, decide our next move." Eleanor studied his back as they walked. Broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist, the confident stride of a man accustomed to navigating treacherous terrain. His clothes were worn but serviceable, heavy canvas pants, a wool shirt beneath a leather vest, sturdy boots caked with the same reddish mud that now stained her own shoes. A prospector's hat hung from a cord at his neck, bouncing slightly with each step. "You said you've been mapping these tunnels," she ventured after they had walked in silence for what felt like an eternity. "Why?" He paused at a junction where the main shaft split in two directions, considering each path before choosing the one that angled slightly downward. "Silver," he said simply. The original miners gave up too easily. They followed the main vein until it pinched out, never bothered to explore the smaller branches. "And you think there's more to be found?" "I know there is." Something in his tone, a quiet certainty, caught her attention. "You have a name?" she asked, suddenly aware that she was following a man whose name she didn't even know. He glanced back at her, his face half illuminated by the lantern he carried. "Jackson. Matthew Jackson." She waited for him to ask her name in return, but he didn't. Either he already knew who she was, or he didn't care. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a natural chamber perhaps 20 feet across. Several smaller tunnels branched off in different directions, their entrances gaping like black mouths in the dim light. Jackson hung the lantern on a hook, hammered into one of the support beams, illuminating a space that showed signs of recent use. A small cast-iron stove sat in one corner, next to a bedroll and a wooden crate serving as both table and chair. Tools were arranged neatly against one wall, picks, shovels, a sledgehammer, and more specialized equipment Eleanor couldn't name. "Your camp," she observed. Jackson nodded, moving to the stove. "Been working in this section for about 3 months. He opened the stove door, placed kindling inside, and struck a match. The dry wood caught quickly, and soon a small but warming fire burned within the iron belly of the stove. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the crate. "You look dead on your feet." Eleanor hesitated, then decided conserving her strength was the wiser choice. She perched on the edge of the crate, keeping her satchel close and her hand near the revolver at her waist. Jackson noticed the gesture, but made no comment as he hung a battered coffee pot over the stove. "Blackwell's men will search the town," he said, measuring coffee grounds from a tin into the pot. "But they won't find the entrance to this shaft without knowing where to look. Even if they did, there are miles of tunnels down here. Easy to get lost if you don't know the way." "And you do?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. Jackson's expression remained unreadable as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. He handed it to her without comment. Eleanor opened it carefully to reveal a detailed map drawn in pencil, showing an intricate network of tunnels spreading beneath the mountain like the roots of some enormous tree. Notes were scribbled in the margins, measurements, dates, small sketches of geological features. It was the work of a meticulous mind, someone who left nothing to chance. "You drew this?" she asked, genuinely impressed despite her wariness. "Over time," he replied with a shrug. "Each tunnel I explore, each chamber I map. It's slow work, but necessary." For finding silver, his eyes met hers briefly. Among other things, the coffee pot began to steam, filling the chamber with a rich aroma that made Eleanor's empty stomach clench painfully. How long had it been since she'd eaten a proper meal? Days, at least. The jerky and biscuits she'd rationed so carefully had been poor substitutes for real food. As if reading her thoughts, Jackson reached into a canvas sack near his bedroll and withdrew a parcel wrapped in waxed paper. He unwrapped it to reveal strips of dried venison and a half-loaf of dark bread that looked fresher than anything Eleanor had seen in weeks. "Eat," he said, offering her the parcel. "Can't think straight when you're starving." Eleanor wanted to refuse, to maintain whatever small advantage her independence might offer, but hunger won out. She took a piece of venison and tore into it with as much dignity as she could muster, which wasn't much. The meat was tough but flavorful, seasoned with something smoky and vaguely sweet. "Thank you," she said after swallowing her first bite. Manners, at least, remained when all other trappings of her former life had been stripped away. Jackson nodded once, accepting her thanks without comment. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her before settling on his bedroll, his back against the chamber wall. For several minutes they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire in the stove and the distant dripping of water. Eleanor finished the venison and started on the bread, eating more slowly now that the initial pangs of hunger had subsided. "They say you killed your husband," Jackson said finally, his tone neutral, as if commenting on the weather. Eleanor stiffened, her cup halfway to her lips. "They say a lot of things. They say he deserved it." She looked at him sharply. "And what do you say, Mr. Jackson?" He met her gaze steadily. "I say any man who raises his hand to a woman forfeits his right to sympathy when she finally fights back." A chill ran through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the damp air of the tunnel. "You seem well informed about my circumstances." Jackson sipped his coffee before answering. "News travels, even to places like this, especially when there's money attached to it." The bounty. She set her cup down carefully, her appetite suddenly gone. "Is that why you helped me, planning to collect it yourself?" A flicker of something, anger perhaps, crossed his features before his expression settled back into its usual impassivity. "If I wanted the bounty, I wouldn't have warned you about Blackwell." "Unless you're playing a longer game," Eleanor countered, her hand dropping to the revolver at her waist. "Gain my trust, learn what I know, then turn me in when it's convenient." Jackson's laugh was sudden and startlingly genuine, echoing in the chamber. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that." He shook his head, amusement lingering in his eyes. "Lady, I've been down in these tunnels long enough to know there are things worth more than $500. Peace of mind, for one." Eleanor studied him, trying to gauge the truth in his words. He didn't have the look of a liar. His gaze was direct, his manner straightforward to the point of bluntness. But she'd been wrong about men before, catastrophically. "So why did you really help me?" she asked finally. Jackson's expression sobered. He set his coffee aside and rolled up the left sleeve of his shirt, revealing a forearm crisscrossed with old scars, long parallel marks that could only have been made by a whip. 8 years ago, I was arrested in Denver for a robbery I didn't commit," he said quietly. Judge Thomas Reed presided over my trial. He had me convicted and sentenced within a day, despite evidence that placed me miles away when the crime occurred. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "My father," she whispered. Jackson nodded, rolling his sleeve back down. "3 years I spent in territorial prison before the real culprit was caught for another crime and confessed to the Denver robbery. By then, the damage was done." His eyes held hers, not with accusation, but with a simple, stark honesty. "So, when I heard Judge Reed's daughter was on the run with evidence of his corruption, I figured our interests might align." "The ledger," Eleanor said, her hand instinctively moving to the satchel where the damning document was hidden. "You know about it." Rumors, whispers, nothing specific, but enough to guess why a man like Reed would put a bounty on his own daughter's head. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. The weight of everything, her flight, her fear, the impossible situation she found herself in, suddenly overwhelming. When she opened them again, Jackson was watching her with something that might have been concern, or might simply have been calculation. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said, "but right now we both want the same thing, to stay out of Blackwell's hands. That makes us allies, at least temporarily." "And after?" she asked. "What happens when we're clear of Blackwell?" Jackson shrugged. "That depends on what's in that ledger of yours, and what you plan to do with it." Before Eleanor could respond, a distant sound reached them, faint but unmistakable. Voices echoing through the tunnels. Jackson was on his feet instantly, dousing the lantern with a quick motion that plunged the chamber into near darkness, the only light now coming from the small glow of the stove. He moved to the entrance of one of the branching tunnels, listening intently. "They've found the shaft entrance," he said, his voice lowered to barely above a whisper. "Sooner than I expected." Fear clutched at Eleanor's throat. "How?" "Someone in town must have talked. A miner, maybe. Someone who knew about these old workings." Jackson gathered his map and a few essential items, stuffing them into a leather satchel. "We need to move, now." Eleanor was already on her feet, securing her own belongings. "Which way?" Jackson pointed to the smallest of the branching tunnels, a narrow opening that looked barely wide enough for a man to pass through. "That one connects to the lower workings. It's a tight squeeze in places, but it leads to a cavern system that opens out onto the western slope of the mountain." "How far?" Eleanor asked, slinging her satchel across her body. 2 miles, maybe 3. Jackson kicked dirt over the stove, dampening its glow. "If we push hard, we can reach the exit before dawn." The voices grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of boots on stone. Eleanor estimated they had minutes, at most, before Blackwell's men reached the chamber. Jackson handed her a small miner's lamp. The flame adjusted to its lowest setting. "Stay close. Don't speak unless necessary. If we get separated, keep moving. West. The tunnel only branches twice more, and both times you take the path that slopes downward." Eleanor nodded, fear and determination warring within her. She had survived this long. She would not falter now. They slipped into the narrow tunnel, just as light appeared in the main shaft they had traveled earlier. Eleanor heard rough male voices, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakable, hunters who sensed their prey was near. The passage Jackson had chosen narrowed quickly, forcing them to proceed in single file, then to turn sideways in places, where the walls pinched inward. The air grew thinner, harder to breathe, and Eleanor fought against the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. She focused on Jackson's back, on the steady movement of his shoulders as he navigated the treacherous path, on anything but the weight of the mountain pressing down from above. The tunnel twisted and turned, descending at a steeper angle now. Water seeped through cracks in the rock, making the footing treacherous. Twice Eleanor nearly fell, saved only by Jackson's quick hand reaching back to steady her. They had been moving for perhaps half an hour when Jackson suddenly stopped, raising a hand in warning. Eleanor froze, straining to hear over the sound of her own ragged breathing. For a moment there was nothing. Then a scraping sound, the unmistakable echo of boots on stone, still distant, but growing clearer. "They're following our trail," Jackson whispered, his face grim in the faint glow of the lamp. "We're leaving marks in the mud, footprints they can track." "Can we move faster?" Eleanor asked, already knowing the answer. Jackson shook his head. "Not in these narrow sections, and the next chamber is still a quarter-mile ahead." Eleanor made a quick decision. "Then we separate. They're tracking two sets of prints. If we split up, they'll have to choose which to follow." "Too risky," Jackson countered. "You don't know these tunnels." "You said yourself, at the next two." "Branches, take the downward path," she insisted. "I can manage that much." Jackson studied her face, clearly weighing their limited options. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. "There's an abandoned ore cart at the next junction," he said finally. "The left fork leads to a dead end, a cave-in from last year's tremors. If they follow those tracks, it'll buy us time." "You want me to go to the dead end?" Eleanor asked, understanding dawning. Jackson nodded. "Hide in the ore cart. Cover yourself with whatever debris you can find. They'll check the tunnel, but if they don't see you, they might assume the tracks were old, made by miners before the cave-in. And you? I'll take the right fork, leave obvious signs. When they split up, most will follow me." His expression was resolute. "I know these mountains better than they do. I can lead them on a chase that leaves them lost for days." It was a desperate plan, with a dozen ways it could go wrong, but Eleanor could think of no better alternative as the sounds of their pursuers echoed through the narrow passage. "If they find me," she began. "They won't," Jackson cut her off, "but if something goes wrong, I'll circle back for you. Just stay hidden, stay quiet." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. This man who had every reason to hate her family was risking his life to save hers. The irony wasn't lost on her. "The junction is just ahead," Jackson whispered, already moving again. "Be ready to move quickly when we reach it." They crept forward, every step deliberate, every sound magnified in the confined space. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was certain their pursuers must hear it echoing through the stone. Her palms were slick with sweat, making it difficult to maintain her grip on the small lamp. The tunnel widened slightly, and then they were there, a rough-hewn chamber where three passages branched off like spokes from a wheel. In one corner sat an ancient ore cart, its metal sides dented and rusted, half filled with broken rock and mining debris. Jackson pointed silently to the left passage, then to the cart. Eleanor nodded her understanding. He gripped her shoulder. Briefly, a gesture of reassurance that conveyed more than words could have, then turned toward the right passage. "Wait," Eleanor whispered, reaching into her satchel. Her fingers closed around the leather-bound ledger, the source of all her troubles and her only leverage. She hesitated only a moment before pressing it into Jackson's hands. "If they find me, this is better off with you." Surprise flickered across his features as he recognized what she had given him. "Eleanor, you know what to do with it," she said quietly. "Make them pay. All of them." For a heartbeat they stood frozen, the weight of the moment suspended between them. Then Jackson nodded once, tucking the ledger securely into his own satchel. "I'll come back for you," he promised, and something in his voice made her believe him. Then he was gone, disappearing into the right-hand tunnel with the stealth of a man accustomed to moving unseen. Eleanor didn't waste the precious seconds watching him go. She extinguished her lamp and made her way to the ore cart, wincing at the screech of metal as she climbed inside. The broken rock bit into her skin as she burrowed beneath it, ignoring the discomfort, focusing only on covering herself as completely as possible. When she was satisfied, she lay still, barely breathing, and waited. The voices came first, then the bobbing lights of lanterns. Boots scraped on stone as Blackwell's men entered the junction chamber, their harsh breathing echoing off the walls. "Tracks. Split here," a gruff voice announced. "Two directions." "She's not alone," another voice replied, this one smoother, colder. "Been saying that all along." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She knew that voice, Marcus Blackwell himself, not sending his men, but leading the hunt personally. Her father must have offered him a substantial bonus to bring her in. "Simpson, Peters, check that left tunnel," Blackwell ordered. "Rest of you with me. The main tracks lead right." "Left tunnel's a dead end, boss," someone objected. "Cave in about 50 yards in, old workings abandoned years ago." "Check it anyway," Blackwell snapped. $500 doesn't hide in obvious places." Two sets of footsteps approached the left tunnel, passing within feet of the ore cart where Eleanor lay hidden. She held her breath, pressing deeper into the rocky debris that concealed her, ignoring the sharp edges that dug into her skin. Her hand found the revolver at her waist, fingers curling around the grip. If they found her, she would not be taken without a fight. The lantern light receded as the main group followed Jackson's trail into the right tunnel. Only the two men Blackwell had designated remained, their muttered complaints about wasted effort growing fainter as they made their way down the left passage. Eleanor remained motionless, counting seconds in her head, trying to gauge how long it would take them to reach the cave-in and return. 2 minutes passed, 5, 10. She strained to hear any sound of their approach, but the tunnels had gone silent. 20 minutes stretched into 30. Eleanor's muscles screamed in protest at remaining still for so long, but she dared not move. Blackwell was thorough, methodical. He might have left a man behind, hidden in the shadows, waiting for exactly such a mistake. When she could bear it no longer, she shifted slightly, just enough to ease the worst of the pressure points where rock dug into her flesh. No sound of alarm came, no sudden movement from the darkness. Carefully, so carefully, she raised her head, just enough to peer over the edge of the ore cart. The junction chamber appeared empty. The passages dark and silent. She listened for another full minute before daring to move again, slowly extracting herself from her hiding place, wincing as pebbles clattered softly against metal. Where were the two men Blackwell had sent to check the dead end? "They should have returned by now," rejoined the main group. "Unless—" A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the cool air of the tunnel. Unless Jackson had circled back, dealt with them silently before they could report the cave-in, was truly abandoned. The thought of what that might entail made her stomach clench, but she pushed it aside. Survival first, moral qualms later. Eleanor retrieved her lamp, but didn't light it. Better to navigate by touch than risk the light being seen if anyone remained nearby. She moved to the entrance of the right-hand tunnel, the one Jackson had taken, leading Blackwell and his men away from her. "West," he had said. "Keep moving west, taking the downward path at each branch." She could do that. She would do that. And perhaps, if fortune finally showed her some kindness, she would find Jackson waiting at the tunnel's end. With one hand trailing along the rough stone wall and the other gripping her revolver, Eleanor stepped into the darkness, leaving behind the only man who had shown her kindness in months. Whether that kindness was genuine or merely a calculated move in some larger game remained to be seen, but for now she walked alone, each step carrying her deeper into the mountain's secret heart, where silver veins glimmered like frozen rivers in the ancient stone, and where perhaps a new life awaited beyond the reach of bounty hunters and the long, corrupt arm of her father's influence. The western tunnel stretched before Eleanor like a throat leading into the mountain's belly. Hours had passed since she'd separated from Jackson. How many, she couldn't be certain in this lightless world where time lost all meaning. She had finally risked lighting her small lamp, keeping the flame at its lowest setting, just enough to prevent her from walking headlong into a support beam or stumbling into some unseen chasm. The path had descended steadily, just as Jackson had said it would. Twice she had encountered branching tunnels, and both times chosen the downward slope, hoping his directions would lead her to safety rather than deeper into this labyrinth. The air grew warmer as she descended, heavy with mineral. scents and the earthy perfume of undisturbed places. Water trickled somewhere nearby, the sound both comforting and disorienting as it echoed through the passageways. Her legs ached, muscles stiff from the unaccustomed climb and the constant tension of moving through darkness. The revolver felt heavy at her waist, a constant reminder of dangers both behind and potentially ahead. She had 5 bullets remaining, 5 chances if Blackwell's men found her again. Eleanor paused at a widening in the tunnel, leaning against the damp stone wall to catch her breath. The silence pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the steady drip of water and her own labored breathing. Had Jackson escaped? Had he managed to lead Blackwell and his men astray, or had they caught him, forced him to reveal her location? The possibilities spun through her mind, each more disquieting than the last. And what of the ledger? She had given Jackson her only leverage, the sole piece of evidence that might one day clear her name. If he betrayed her, or if misfortune befell him, that evidence would be lost forever. She would remain a fugitive, forever looking over her shoulder, forever running from the law and her father's influence. The thought of her father sent a fresh wave of anger through her. Judge Thomas Reed, whose stern face had graced the walls of courtrooms and whose name commanded respect in every county from Boston to Denver. She had spent her life trying to win his approval, to be the daughter he wanted, proper, obedient, ornamental. How easily he had discarded her when she became inconvenient, how quickly he had branded her a murderess and set the dogs on her trail. Eleanor pushed away from the wall, forcing herself to continue. Dwelling on her father's betrayal would not help her now. One step after another, that was all that mattered. Survive this hour, then the next. The tunnel curved sharply to the left, then opened suddenly into a cavern so vast that her small lamp couldn't illuminate the ceiling. Stalactites hung like stone icicles above, their tips glistening with moisture that caught and reflected her light. The floor descended in a series of natural terraces toward a pool of water that gleamed black as ink in the center of the chamber. Eleanor stood transfixed, momentarily forgetting her fear in the face of such unexpected grandeur. This was no man-made mineshaft, but a natural cathedral carved by water and time, untouched by human hands, until miners had broken through its wall by accident or design. A sound startled her from her reverie, a soft scrape of boot against stone, somewhere to her right. Eleanor extinguished her lamp instantly, plunging herself into complete darkness. She drew her revolver, pressing her back against the cavern wall, straining to hear over the thundering of her own heart. "It's just me," came Jackson's voice, low and steady. "You can light your lamp again." Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her knees weak. "Jackson?" A match flared, illuminating his weathered face. He lit his own lantern, adjusting the wick to cast just enough light for them to see each other clearly. He looked tired, a streak of dirt across his forehead, but otherwise unharmed. "You made it," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Told you I'd circle back." Blackwell led them on a merry chase through the upper tunnels, Jackson replied, setting his lantern on a nearby, a rock shelf. "Doubled back through an air shaft they didn't know about. They're still up there, I expect, turning in circles." Eleanor holstered her revolver, suddenly aware of how tightly she'd been gripping it. "The men he sent down the left tunnel?" Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Won't be reporting back?" She didn't ask for details. Some things were better left unspoken in this twilight world between civilization and wilderness. "The ledger?" she asked instead. Jackson patted his satchel. "Safe. Didn't open it, though I admit I was tempted." "I'm surprised." "Said I'd help you. Man's only as good as his word out here." Eleanor studied him in the lantern light, this man who had saved her life and yet remained largely a mystery. "Where are we?" "About a mile beneath Silverton. Jackson replied, moving toward the water's edge. This cavern connects to a series of natural tunnels that lead to the western slope. We'll rest here for a bit, then continue. Should reach the exit by midday. And then? He glanced back at her. That depends on you. How far are you planning to run? It was a fair question. Eleanor had been running for so long that stopping seemed almost unimaginable. As far as I need to, she answered honestly. Jackson knelt by the pool, dipping his hand into the water. This is good water, sweet. You should drink while you can. Eleanor approached cautiously, kneeling beside him. The water was crystalline, reflecting the lantern light like a mirror. She cupped her hands and drank deeply, the cold shocking her senses awake. It tasted of minerals and earth, but was clean in a way that made her realize how long she'd been surviving on stale canteen. Water. There's a camp, Jackson said after they had both quenched their thirst. On the other side of the mountain, not on any map, not a proper town, just a collection of cabins and tents, people who prefer to live beyond the reach of marshals and tax collectors. Outlaws, Eleanor translated. Jackson's expression hardened slightly. Some, maybe. Others just folk who don't fit the mold civilization tries to press them into. Prospectors, hunters, women running from bad situations. He looked at her pointedly. No one asks too many questions there. And you think they'd take in a wanted? Murderess? I think they'd take in anyone willing to pull their weight and mind their business. He reached into his satchel and withdrew something wrapped in oilcloth. Unwrapping it revealed a hunk of deer meat, cured and darkened with smoke, and a few strips of dried apple. Eat something. The next stretch is harder going. Eleanor accepted the offering gratefully, tearing into the meat with the hunger of someone who had spent too many days on too little food. She forced herself to eat slowly, savoring each bite, knowing her shrunken stomach would rebel if she bolted her food. Jackson busied himself refilling their canteens and checking his map by the lantern light, allowing her the dignity of eating, without being watched. Another small kindness that she noted and filed away in her growing assessment of the man. This settlement, she said finally, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Does it have a name? Those who need to find it. Call it Haven, Jackson replied, folding his map carefully. Been there a few times, trading silver ore for supplies. Good people for the most part. Tough, but fair. And they know you there? Trust you? He nodded. As much as anyone trusts anyone out here. It wasn't much of a recommendation, but it was. More than Eleanor had hoped for when she'd been hiding in that abandoned assayer's office just a day earlier. A place beyond her father's reach, beyond Blackwell's jurisdiction. A place to catch her breath, at least, before deciding her next move. "Why are you helping me?" she asked abruptly, needing to hear it again, to test his answer against her own judgment. Jackson studied her for a long moment before responding. "Told you! Your father put me away for 3 years for something I didn't do, missing my mother's passing, my sister's wedding." His jaw tightened. "Lost my claim. Lost damn near. Everything. When I got out, there was nothing left for me in Denver but bad memories. So this is revenge," Eleanor said quietly. "Using me to get back at him." "Justice," Jackson corrected. "Those pages you're carrying." He gestured to his satchel, where the ledger rested. "They're not just about your father, are they? Names, dates, amounts, records of every bribe, every fixed case, every man wrongfully convicted to serve someone else's interests." Eleanor nodded slowly. He kept meticulous records, everything in his own hand impossible to deny. Names of businessmen, politicians, all the men who paid him to ensure certain verdicts. "And you think exposing that will clear your name? Make it safe for you to stop running?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed strangely in the cavern. "My name will never be clear. I did kill my husband regardless of the reason. But the ledger might ensure that my father and his cronies face consequences for their crimes. That's worth something." Jackson considered this, his expression thoughtful. Worth dying for? Maybe. I haven't decided yet. He nodded, as if this was the answer he'd expected. Well, can't decide anything if Blackwell catches you. We should move on. He gathered his belongings, securing them in his satchel. The tunnel we want is on the far side of the pool. It narrows considerably for the first 100 yards or so. You claustrophobic? Eleanor thought of the ore cart, where she'd hidden, buried under rocks with barely enough space to breathe. Not anymore. The ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips. Good. Stay close and watch your footing. Parts of the path are slick. They circled the underground pool, the lantern light dancing across the water's surface, casting wavering shadows on the cavern walls. Eleanor felt a strange reluctance to leave this peaceful grotto, to return to the confines of the narrow tunnels and the constant tension of flight. But there was no refuge here, only temporary respite. The tunnel Jackson led her to was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a man of his size to pass through. They proceeded single file, the ceiling gradually lowering until they were forced to duck, then to crouch, then finally to crawl on hands and knees through a passage so confined that Eleanor had to fight against rising panic with each breath. Not much farther, Jackson called back, his voice oddly distorted in the tight space. Tunnel opens up ahead. Eleanor focused on his boots, just visible in the dim light of the lantern he had placed before him as he crawled. One movement after another, hands finding purchase on the smooth stone, knees scraping against the ground. She had endured worse. She would endure this. True to his word, the passage suddenly widened, allowing them to stand once more. Eleanor straightened gratefully, wincing as her stiff muscles protested the movement. They had entered another tunnel, this one clearly man-made, with rough-hewn walls and timber supports spaced at regular intervals. Old Spanish working, Jackson explained, noting her inspection of their surroundings. From when this territory was still part of Mexico. They were following a gold vein, but it played out quickly. How do you know all this? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about this man who seemed to carry the mountain's history in his head. Jackson shrugged. Been exploring these tunnels for years, off and on. You learn to read the signs. Different tools leave different marks. Spanish miners use narrower picks than American ones. Their support beams are placed closer together. He continued forward, his stride confident even in the dim light. Eleanor followed, her body settling into the rhythm of their movement, the constant descent into the mountain's depths. They walked in companionable silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts. Tell me about Haven, Eleanor said finally, needing conversation to distract her from the ache in her legs and the gnawing uncertainty of what awaited them beyond these tunnels. Jackson glanced back at her, then returned his gaze to the path. Ahead. It's nothing fancy. About 20 permanent structures, cabins mostly, a few sturdier buildings, double that intense depending on the season. There's a trading post run by a fellow named Harlan Willis, cantankerous old coot but honest in his dealings. A bathhouse of sorts, fed by a hot spring. No church, no jail, no formal law. How do they resolve disputes? Council of Elders, elected, by common agreement. 5 men, 2 women. They hear grievances, make judgments. Serious offenses are punished by exile, which is often a death sentence in these mountains. And how do newcomers integrate? Eleanor asked, choosing her words. Carefully, Jackson seemed to understand the question beneath her question. Everyone contributes according to their abilities. Hunters bring meat, prospectors trade ore, craftspeople make or repair what's needed. Some tend gardens in the summer months. Others brew liquor potent enough to blind a man if he's not careful. He paused, considering. You had any experience with that? Gardening, I mean, not the liquor? Eleanor thought of the kitchen garden she had tended behind the Boston house, the careful rows of herbs and vegetables that had been her quiet rebellion against her father's insistence that a judge's daughter need not soil her hands with such common labor. Some, she admitted. though nothing beyond common vegetables and herbs. Jackson nodded. That's valuable. Fresh food's hard to come by in the mountains, especially in winter. Willis trades salt and sugar for produce when he can. Get it? The tunnel forked suddenly, and Jackson chose the right-hand path without hesitation. This passage sloped more steeply downward, the air growing noticeably warmer as they descended. Distant sounds reached them, a rush of water, perhaps, or the whisper of wind through stone. "We're close to the exit," Jackson said, quickening his pace slightly. "Another quarter-mile at most." Eleanor matched his stride, a curious mixture of anticipation and dread building within her. The mountain's darkness had become a strange sort of sanctuary, insulating her from the dangers of the world above. What awaited her beyond these tunnels was unknown, unpredictable. "What will you tell them?" she asked suddenly. "The people at Haven." "About me." Jackson slowed, considering her question. "Nothing they need to know. That you're running from trouble back east. That you need somewhere to catch your breath before moving on. And they won't ask for details." "Some might." "You don't have to answer." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his understanding. The less people knew of her true circumstances, the safer she and they would be. The tunnel widened gradually, the rough stone walls giving way to smoother surfaces where water had shaped the rock over countless centuries. Light appeared ahead, not the harsh glare of midday sun, but a softer illumination that suggested filtered daylight. Jackson extinguished his lantern as they approached the exit, allowing their eyes to adjust gradually to the increasing light. The tunnel mouth was partially concealed by a fall of vines and scrub brush, offering concealment from casual observation. "Wait here," Jackson instructed, moving ahead to the very edge of the opening. He scanned the area carefully before gesturing for Eleanor to join him. She approached cautiously, blinking as her eyes adjusted to natural light after so many hours underground. They had emerged halfway up a steep, wooded slope, with mountains rising on three sides and a narrow valley spreading out below. A stream flashed silver in the afternoon sun, winding among stands of pine and aspen. There was no sign of human habitation visible from their vantage point, no smoke rising from hidden chimneys, no cleared fields or grazing livestock. "Where's Haven?" Eleanor asked, surveying the wilderness before them. Jackson pointed to a distant notch between two peaks, barely visible through the trees. "Other side of that pass. About 5 miles as the crow flies, longer by the trail. We can make it by nightfall if we push on." Eleanor nodded, drawing a deep breath of fresh mountain air into her lungs. After the closed confines of the tunnels, the open sky above felt almost dizzying. She had escaped Blackwell, at least for now, had found an unlikely ally in a man her father had wronged, had glimpsed the possibility of a refuge, however temporary. It wasn't freedom, not truly. She would always be looking over her shoulder, always listening for approaching hoofbeats, always wondering if today was the day her past would catch up with her. But it was a reprieve, a chance to gather her strength before the next phase of this life she had never chosen, but now had to navigate. "Ready?" Jackson asked, his expression unreadable as he watched her. Eleanor squared her shoulders, adjusting the satchel that contained her few remaining possessions. The woman who had stepped into that tunnel beneath Silverton was not the same one emerging now into the wilderness. Something had shifted during those hours in the darkness. A shedding of old certainties, perhaps, or the first tenuous growth of new ones. "Ready," she confirmed, and followed him into the forest, leaving the mountain and its secrets behind. The forest path wound through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, their leaves shimmering gold in the late afternoon light. Jackson moved with the quiet confidence of a man intimately familiar with the wilderness, his steps purposeful yet careful. Eleanor followed, her city-bred instincts gradually adapting to the rhythm of the mountain. They had been walking for nearly 2 hours, maintaining a brisk pace that left little breath for conversation. The air grew cooler as they climbed toward the pass Jackson had indicated, the sun sliding toward the western peaks. Eleanor's legs ached from the unaccustomed exertion, but she pushed through the discomfort without complaint. Weakness was a luxury she could no longer afford. "We'll rest here," Jackson announced, stopping in a small clearing beside a tumble of boulders. "Need to be fresh for the last climb." Eleanor sank gratefully onto a fallen log, stretching her stiff legs before her. The forest surrounded them, the dense canopy filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the needle-strewn ground. Birds called from the branches above, their voices unfamiliar to her eastern ears. Jackson unslung his canteen and offered it to her. "Drink. The air's thinner up here." She accepted it with a nod of thanks, taking a measured sip before returning it to him. "How much farther to the pass?" "Another hour, maybe less," he replied, scanning the ridge above them. "Then it's downhill to Haven. We should make it by dusk." Eleanor followed his gaze to the notch between peaks, now more clearly visible through breaks in the trees. Beyond that narrow passage lay yet another unfamiliar world, one without judges or law books or societal expectations. A world where no one knew Eleanor Reed, where she might become someone else entirely. "You're quiet," Jackson observed, settling onto a boulder across from her. Eleanor managed a tired smile. "Just thinking about what comes next." "Been running so long you've forgotten how to stand still?" The perceptiveness of his observation caught her off guard. "Something like that." Jackson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Took me a year after prison to stop flinching at sudden movements. Another year before I could sleep through the night." He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard labor. "Some wounds don't show on the skin." It was the most personal thing he had shared with her, this glimpse of vulnerability beneath his stoic exterior. Eleanor found herself wanting to offer something in return, some truth of her own. "I don't dream about Jacob," she said quietly. "Everyone assumes I must, that killing my husband haunts my sleep, but it's not him I see when I close my eyes." She paused, the admission difficult even now. "It's my father, standing in his study looking at me like I'm a stranger, like I never mattered at all." Jackson said nothing, but his silence was attentive rather than dismissive. He was listening, truly listening in a way few people ever had. "He didn't even ask for my side of the story," Eleanor continued, the words flowing now that she had begun. "Just told me to get out, to disappear. Said I was dead to him. Then he put a price on my head to make sure I stayed gone. Some men value their reputation more than their own blood," Jackson said finally. "Doesn't make it right, just makes it what it is." Eleanor nodded, a lump forming in her throat. All her life, she had sought her father's approval, measuring her worth against his impossible standards. Even now, a fugitive because of his corruption, part of her still craved the validation he had always withheld. "You did right," Jackson added unexpectedly, taking that ledger. "Men like your father, they only understand one kind of justice, the kind that threatens what they value, money, power, standing among their peers." "If I can get it to the right people," Eleanor said, doubt creeping into her voice. "Someone who—" "They can't be bought or threatened." Jackson's expression hardened slightly. "There's always someone who can be bought, but there's also always someone with a grudge, someone who's been waiting for the chance to bring down a powerful man. The trick is finding them. Is that what you were doing in Silverton, looking for such a person?" He shook his head. "Was just working on my claim. Silver's the one thing that doesn't lie, doesn't change its mind. It's either there in the rock, or it isn't." There was a simplicity to his worldview that Eleanor found oddly comforting. In Boston, everything had been veiled in layers of complexity, social obligations, unspoken expectations, the intricate dance of appearance versus reality. Here in the wilderness, with this taciturn miner, clarity seemed possible. Jackson stood, suddenly head tilted as he listened to something beyond Eleanor's perception. She tensed, hand moving instinctively toward her revolver. "Dear," he said after a moment, relaxing slightly. "Moving east of us. We're alone." Eleanor exhaled slowly, forcing her fingers to unclench. "How can you tell?" "Pattern of movement, rhythm of the footfalls." He offered a small, rare smile. "Bounty hunters make different sounds, heavier, more purposeful." "You've had practice listening for them," she observed. Jackson's smile faded. "Not just bounty hunters, marshals, claim jumpers, men who think a solitary miner is an easy target." He touched the knife at his belt, the gesture unconscious. "You learn to hear what's coming, or you don't last long." Eleanor nodded, understanding now another dimension of this man who had rescued her. He wasn't simply a wronged ex-prisoner with a grudge against corrupt justice. He was a survivor, same as she was becoming. Someone who had rebuilt his life in the margins, in the spaces overlooked or abandoned by civilization. "We should move on," Jackson said, gathering his pack. "Want to clear the pass before the light fails?" Eleanor rose, wincing slightly as her muscles protested. Jackson noticed, reaching into his satchel and extracting a small tin. He opened it, to reveal a pungent salve, greenish-brown and thick. "For your legs," he explained, offering it to her. "Indian remedy, wild mint and bear grease, few other things. Works on trail soreness." Eleanor accepted the tin, surprised again by this unexpected consideration. "Thank you." Jackson turned away, giving her privacy as she applied the salve to her aching calves through her torn stockings. The ointment tingled against her skin, the sharp mint scent cutting through the earthy smell of bear fat. Almost immediately she felt a warming sensation, the pain receding to a manageable ache. "It helps," she said with genuine gratitude. Returning the tin, Jackson nodded, seemingly pleased. "Old Shoshone woman taught me that recipe, saved my feet more than once." He secured the tin in his pack and gestured toward the trail. "Ready?" The path grew steeper as they approached the pass, the trees thinning to reveal sweeping views of the valley they had traversed. Eleanor paused occasionally to catch her breath, using these moments to look back at the distance they had covered. The mountain that contained Silverton and its network of tunnels stood stark against the sky, miles behind them now. Somewhere on its far side, Blackwell and his men might still be searching, unaware that their quarry had slipped away beneath the very ground they walked upon. The thought gave her fierce satisfaction. She had outwitted them, at least for now. With Jackson's help, she had found a path none of them could have anticipated. As they neared the summit of the pass, the wind picked up, carrying the crisp scent of snow from higher elevations. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter around her, grateful for its warmth despite its bedraggled state. Another item to add to her growing list of necessities, proper clothing for the mountain climate. The path narrowed, hugging the side of the mountain. With a sheer drop on the outer edge, Jackson moved with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, but slowed his pace to accommodate Eleanor's more cautious progress. No words passed between them, but she felt his awareness of her presence, the way he paused at particularly treacherous spots, how he occasionally glanced back to ensure she was managing. It was a different kind of courtesy than she had known. In Boston, where men offered their arms on city streets and pulled out chairs at dinner tables. Jackson's consideration was practical, utilitarian, but no less genuine for its lack of social polish. They reached the summit as the sun touched the western peaks, bathing the landscape in golden light. Eleanor stopped, momentarily transfixed by the vista that spread before them. A valley opened up below, cradled by mountains on all sides, with a silver ribbon of river winding through its center. The forest was thicker here, darker, interrupted only by occasional meadows and what appeared to be small clearings where the orderly shapes of human habitation were just visible through the trees. "Haven," Jackson said, coming to stand beside her. About an hour's walk down to the valley floor. Eleanor surveyed what would be her new home, at least temporarily. From this distance, it seemed impossibly remote, protected by nature itself from the world beyond these mountains. A place where a person could disappear, could reinvent themselves far from the reach of telegraphs and wanted posters. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Jackson nodded. "Gets under your skin after a while. Hard to imagine living anywhere else." There was a note in his voice she hadn't heard before, a warmth, almost an affection, when he spoke of this hidden community. This place meant something to him beyond mere sanctuary or convenience. "Is it home for you?" she asked, curious about this glimpse of sentiment in a man who kept his emotions carefully guarded. Jackson considered the question longer than she expected. "Close as I've come to one since Denver," he finally admitted. "I keep my claim near. Silverton, work it when the weather permits, but in the winter months when the high passes close." He gestured toward the valley. "Better company than just the mountains talking back at you." Eleanor smiled at the image of this solitary man seeking human connection when the wilderness grew too isolating, even for his independent spirit. It softened her perception of him, this acknowledgement of a need for community despite his self-sufficient nature. They began their descent, the path switchbacking down the mountainside through stands of spruce and fir. The way was easier now, less exposed, though the fading light made footing treacherous in places. Jackson produced a small tin lantern from his pack, lighting it as darkness gathered beneath the trees. "Almost there," he said as they reached the valley floor, the path widening into something closer to a proper trail. "Need to announce ourselves properly, though. Folk here get jumpy about unexpected visitors." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small metal whistle carved with symbols Eleanor didn't recognize. When he blew it, the sound was surprisingly low and melodious, more like a bird call than a shrill alert. He repeated the sequence 3 times, then waited. After a moment, an answering call came from the trees ahead. Similar, but not identical, a response in what seemed to be a simple code. Jackson visibly relaxed. "Friend on watch tonight," he explained, moving forward again. "That was Benson's signal." They followed the trail as it curved alongside a swift-running creek, the water chattering over stones in the growing darkness. Firelight appeared through the trees, and then they were there. The outskirts of Haven. It was both more and less than Eleanor had expected. The settlement consisted of perhaps 24 structures scattered thoughtfully among the trees, then arranged in orderly rows, like a proper town. Cabins of varying sizes and states of repair stood beside more temporary dwellings. Canvas tents on wooden platforms, lean-tos built against the trunks of massive pines. Smoke rose from stone chimneys and metal stovepipes, carrying the comforting scent of wood fire into the evening air. People moved among the buildings, carrying water from the creek, tending cook fires, attending to end-of-day tasks. They glanced up as Jackson and Eleanor approached, curiosity evident in their expressions, but without the immediate suspicion Eleanor had feared. A tall man with a silver-streaked beard stepped forward, a rifle held casually, but not threateningly, in the crook of his arm. "Jackson," he greeted, his voice a deep rumble. "Been a while." "Benson," Jackson returned with a nod. "Winter's coming early to the high country. Thought I'd best get established here before the passes close." Benson's shrewd eyes shifted to Eleanor, assessing but not unfriendly. "And your companion?" "Eleanor," Jackson replied, offering no surname. "Ran into some trouble back east. Needs a place to weather it out." The simplicity of the introduction surprised Eleanor. No elaborate explanation, no detailed backstory, just the basic truth, stripped of specifics. Benson seemed to accept this minimal information without question. "Always room for one more before the snow flies," he said with a nod toward Eleanor. "Willis has had a spare cabin since the Morgans. Headed to California. Needs work, but the roof's sound." "Appreciated," Jackson said. Benson's attention returned to Jackson. You staying at your usual place? If it's still standing, Palmer's been keeping an eye on it for you. Chased off a bear last month, said it was eyeing your door like it had a grudge. A slight smile touched Jackson's lips. Tell him I'm obliged. With a final nod to them both, Benson returned to his post at the edge of the settlement. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute, yet in that brief conversation, arrangements had been made, hospitality extended, Eleanor's presence acknowledged, and accepted without demands for credentials or detailed explanations. That's it? She asked quietly as they moved deeper into the settlement. No questions about who I am, where I came from? Questions will come, Jackson replied, but not right away, not unless you give folks reason to be concerned. He glanced at her. Don't mistake lack of curiosity for lack of awareness. Everyone here has eyes, ears. They'll form their own judgments based on what you do, not what you say. It was both reassuring and unsettling, this community with its own unwritten codes, its alternative approach to trust and verification. So different from Boston society, with its letters of introduction, its careful vetting of newcomers, its rigid adherence to known hierarchies. They passed what appeared to be the settlement center, a large fire pit surrounded by log benches, where several people sat talking, a pot of something fragrant suspended over the flames. Beyond it stood a substantial log structure with a proper porch and glass windows, a painted sign identifying it as Willis Trading Post. A few smaller buildings clustered nearby, what looked like a smithy, judging by the forge still glowing. Faintly in the gathering darkness, a stable and a larger cabin with multiple windows from which the sounds of conversation and occasional laughter emerged. Way station, Jackson explained, following her gaze to the latter building. Closest thing to a saloon Haven has. Food, drink, place for travelers to sleep if they're passing through. He led her past these central buildings toward a more secluded area where cabins stood spaced among the trees, each with its own small garden plot or woodpile. They stopped before a sturdy-looking structure set back from the main path, its windows dark, but its construction solid. Home for tonight, Jackson said, moving up the 2 steps to the door. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it, pushing the door open to reveal a Spartan but comfortable-looking interior. I keep a place here year-round. Makes more sense than rebuilding every winter. Eleanor followed him inside, taking in her surroundings as Jackson lit a lamp on a side table. The cabin consisted of one main room with a stone fireplace, a plank table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. A curtained alcove, presumably concealed storage space. Simple, functional, without ornamentation or excess, much like the man himself. I'll get a fire started, Jackson said, moving to the hearth where wood was already stacked in readiness. Then we'll see about that cabin Benson mentioned for you. Eleanor stood awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly uncertain of her place in this arrangement. Jackson had been her guide, her protector on the journey here. But now they had arrived, and the parameters of their relationship were no longer clear. I'm sorry, she said finally. I've imposed too much on your hospitality already. I can find somewhere else to stay tonight. Jackson looked up from where he knelt by the fireplace, surprise evident in his expression. It's nearly full dark. You're exhausted and you don't know a soul here except me, he pointed out pragmatically. Cabin will still be there in the morning. Put that way, it made perfect sense. Eleanor nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Thank you. Jackson returned his attention to the fire, striking sparks into the tinder he had arranged. Besides, he added, his voice almost casual, safest place for you tonight is with someone Haven folks already know. Gives you a chance to rest before facing new faces and questions tomorrow. The consideration behind his words touched her unexpectedly. Throughout their desperate flight from Silverton, Jackson had demonstrated not just competence, but a gruff kindness that asked nothing in return. He had guided her, fed her, protected her, and now offered shelter, all without demanding explanations or extracting promises. As the fire caught and spread to the larger logs, filling the cabin with warmth and flickering light, Eleanor felt something inside her shift and settle. For the first time in months, perhaps longer, she was not entirely alone. Not safe, not free of danger, but no longer carrying the entire weight of survival on her own shoulders. It was, she realized with some surprise, a feeling dangerously close to hope. A week passed quickly in Haven, each day bringing new lessons. In survival, beyond the boundaries of civilization. Eleanor had moved into the small cabin Benson had mentioned, a sturdy, if weathered structure at the eastern edge of the settlement. The roof was indeed sound, as promised, though the walls needed chinking, and one window had required new oil paper to keep out the increasingly bitter mountain wind. She had thrown herself into repairs with surprising dedication, grateful for the physical labor that left her too exhausted each night to dwell on the precariousness of her situation. Jackson had shown her how to mix clay, straw, and pine pitch to seal the gaps between logs, had helped her repair the stone chimney where it had crumbled at the top. The residents of Haven, observing her willingness to work, had gradually begun to accept her presence among them. Harlan Willis, the gruff proprietor of the trading post, had extended credit for essential supplies, a gesture Eleanor understood represented significant trust in this community where everything was measured in tangible value. She had begun repaying that debt by helping sort and catalog his haphazard inventory, employing organizational skills honed in her father's legal offices to bring order to Willis's chaotic stockroom. This morning she sat cross-legged before her cabin's hearth, carefully mending a pair of woolen stockings acquired through trade with Agnes Palmer, an elderly woman who lived near the creek. The stockings were darned in multiple places already, but would be essential as winter approached. Eleanor's fine Boston needle skills, once employed on decorative embroidery, now served the far more practical purpose of extending the life of precious garments. A knock at the door interrupted her work. She set aside her mending and rose, automatically checking that the revolver was within reach before calling, "Who is it?" Jackson. She opened the door to find him standing on her small porch, a burlap sack in one hand. The late October morning was crisp, his breath visible in the clear air. "Morning," he greeted, his eyes taking in her appearance with a quick, assessing glance. "Brought you something?" He extended the sack, which Eleanor accepted with curiosity. Inside she found a pair of men's boots, smaller than would fit Jackson but sturdy and well-made, with only minimal wear along the soles. "From Willis's new stock," Jackson explained. "Figured your city shoes wouldn't last another week up here." Eleanor looked down at her once fine leather boots, now cracked and splitting from hard use. "These are too valuable," she protested. "I can't add more to my debt with Willis." "Already settled," Jackson replied with a slight shrug. "Had some silver from my last dig. Fair trade." Eleanor stared at him, momentarily speechless. The boots represented an extravagant gift in a place where every possession had been earned through labor or careful barter. That Jackson would use his hard-won silver to provide for her comfort struck her deeply. "Thank you," she said finally, meaning it more than the simple words could convey. He nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Winter's coming fast. Need proper footwear to survive up here." He glanced past her into the cabin. "How's the chimney drawing?" "Better after your repairs," she replied, grateful for the change of subject. "No more smoke backing up into the room." "Good. We can get another cord of wood split for you this afternoon. Way the clouds are building might get the first heavy snow within the week." Eleanor had noticed the mountainous clouds gathering to the north, steel grey and pregnant with moisture. The thought of snow, of being truly isolated in this remote outpost, sent a shiver of apprehension through her. Yet there was nowhere else to go, no safer haven from Blackwell and his men, or from her father's influence, than this forgotten corner of the wilderness. "I appreciate all you've done," she said, meeting Jackson's gaze directly. "I know I arrived here unexpectedly, that I've been a burden—" "Not a burden," he interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than sentimental. "You've pulled your weight. Willis says you've brought order to his trading post that he hasn't seen in a decade. Palmer mentions you've been helping with her rheumatics, mixing some Eastern remedy." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Just willow bark tea with honey. Nothing special. Special enough to Palmer. She hasn't been able to grip her crochet hook in months." Jackson leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxing slightly. "Haven works on exchange, not charity. You're finding your place." It was true, Eleanor realized. In just a week, she had begun to carve out a role for herself in this community of outcasts and wanderers. Her skills, organization, basic medicine, fine needlework, were valuable here in ways they never had been in Boston society, where they were merely expected as accomplishments of a proper lady. "I've been meaning to ask," she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to broach the subject that had been on her mind for days. Jackson waited, his expression open if unreadable. "The ledger," Eleanor said finally. "What should we do with it?" Jackson's eyes flickered briefly to the cabin's interior, where the leather-bound book remained hidden beneath a loose floorboard Eleanor had discovered her first night. He had returned it to her once they reached Haven, true to his word, despite having ample opportunity to disappear with it during their journey. "Been thinking on that," he admitted. "Not a simple question." "No," Eleanor agreed. "If it were just about exposing my father, I'd have sent it to a newspaper in Denver the moment we arrived. But there are other names in those pages, powerful men with connections throughout the territory, men who'd kill to keep their corruption secret." Jackson nodded slowly. "And one book of evidence, without someone to authenticate it, would be easily dismissed as forgery or the ravings of a murderess seeking revenge," Eleanor finished, having reached the same conclusion days ago. "I need to find someone who can verify the information, someone whose word would be respected, who couldn't be easily silenced." "That kind of person doesn't typically hide in places like Haven," Jackson observed dryly. "No," Eleanor acknowledged, "which means I'll need to leave eventually, return to civilization, find the right ally." The thought filled her with dread, but she saw no alternative. The ledger was useless without proper authentication, without strategic deployment. Jackson studied her face for a long moment. "Not before spring," he said finally. "Passes will close within weeks. Anyone trying to cross them before thaw would be committing suicide." Though his words were pragmatic, Eleanor heard something else beneath them. Concern, perhaps even protectiveness. In the short time they had known each other, Jackson had become more than a reluctant guide or convenient ally. He was, she realized with some surprise, the closest thing to a friend she had known in years. Spring then, she agreed, feeling both relief and apprehension at the reprieve. Months of safety to regain her strength, plan her next move. But also months during which Blackwell might find her trail, during which her father might extend his reach even into this remote sanctuary. Jackson straightened, about to speak again, when a commotion from the direction of the settlement's entrance caught their attention. Voices were raised in alarm, followed by the sharp report of a rifle, a warning shot, not aimed to kill, but a signal of potential danger. "Stay here," Jackson ordered, his demeanor instantly shifting to alert wariness. He turned and moved swiftly down the path toward the settlement's center, one hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. Eleanor retreated into her cabin, but only long enough to pull on a shawl and retrieve her own weapon. Whatever threat had arrived at Haven's doorstep could very well concern her. She would not cower in ignorance, while others potentially faced danger on her behalf. By the time she reached the central clearing, a small crowd had gathered. At its center stood Benson, his rifle now lowered, but still gripped firmly, facing 3 mounted men whose trail-worn appearance suggested a long, difficult journey. Eleanor hung back at the edge of the gathering, positioning herself behind the broader forms of Haven's residents. From this vantage point, she could observe without being immediately visible to the newcomers. "No law jurisdiction here," Benson was saying, his tone firm but not overtly hostile. "Haven operates under its own council. Whatever warrant you're carrying has no authority in these mountains." The lead rider, a lean man with a weathered face partially concealed by a graying beard, regarded Benson with obvious skepticism. "This isn't about jurisdiction, friend. We're tracking a fugitive, dangerous criminal who murdered her husband back in Colorado territory. Have reason to believe she passed through these parts." Eleanor's blood ran cold. They were not Blackwell's men. She would have recognized them, but they were clearly bounty hunters of some kind, drawn by the same $500 her father had placed on her head. "Lot of people pass through Haven," Benson replied neutrally. "Most keep to themselves, move on when the weather permits." "This one's distinctive," the hunter continued, reaching into his coat to withdraw a folded paper. He opened it to reveal a crude likeness of Eleanor, an artist's rendering based on description rather than direct observation, but recognizable nonetheless. Eleanor Reed, judge's daughter from Boston, killed her husband with a letter opener, stole some valuable documents. Judge is offering $500 for her return. Murmurs rippled through the gathered residents. Eleanor pressed herself deeper into the shadows, aware that even one curious glance in her direction might give her away. Her shortened, darkened hair and weather-roughened appearance provided some disguise, but not enough to withstand direct scrutiny. "Haven't seen her," Benson stated flatly, not even bothering to study the poster, "and wouldn't point you toward her if I had. We don't trade in people here." The hunter's expression hardened. "Not asking you to trade, old man. Asking you to uphold the law." "Whose law?" This from Jackson, who had positioned himself near the front of the crowd, his stance casual but his eyes alert and calculating. "Man who signed that warrant sits in a comfortable office 300 miles from here, never set foot in these mountains. Why should his word matter more than our own council's?" The hunter's attention shifted to Jackson, narrowing in assessment. "And who might you be, friend?" "Someone who knows that papers signed by corrupt judges aren't worth the ink wasted on them," Jackson replied evenly. "Judge Reed's reputation has reached even these mountains, not a name that carries much weight here." A flash of recognition crossed the hunter's features. "You'd be Jackson, then, the miner." His lips curved in a humorless smile. "Heard about you in Silverton. Folks said you might have helped a woman flee before Blackwell could catch her trail. Interesting coincidence." Tension rippled through the assembled residents. Eleanor saw hands drift toward concealed weapons, saw subtle shifts in posture as Haven's people moved protectively closer together. These were not law-abiding townsfolk who would deliver a fugitive out of civic duty. They were outsiders themselves, people who had chosen this remote existence precisely to escape the reach of distant authorities. "No coincidence at all," Jackson replied coolly. "I was working my claim near Silverton until the weather turned, same as I do every year. Any other stories you heard were likely embellished by bored miners with too much whiskey." The hunter's gaze swept the gathered crowd, lingering briefly on each face before moving on. Eleanor held her breath as his eyes passed near her position, but the shadows and her position behind larger residents concealed her effectively. "Well now," the hunter said finally, addressing Benson again. "Seemed to have hit a wall of silence. Here, understandable. Folks in isolated places tend to stick together." He refolded the wanted poster, tucking it deliberately into his coat. "But I should mention, Blackwell's on her trail too. Word is he's got a personal stake in this one." "Beyond the bounty," Eleanor suppressed a shudder. "Blackwell's reputation was fearsome enough, but the suggestion that he had some personal motivation for finding her added a new dimension of dread." "He'll be heading this way once the last storm clears," the hunter continued. Might be worth considering. How he'll react if he discovers you've been harboring his quarry. Might be worth considering how we react to threats against our own, countered a new voice. Willis stepping forward from the trading post's entrance, a shotgun cradled casually in his arms. Haven's stood for 15 years because we look after each other. Man comes in making threats, he usually leaves disappointed, or doesn't leave at all. The implicit warning hung in the crisp autumn air. The hunter surveyed the now openly hostile faces surrounding him, clearly recalculating his approach. No threats intended, he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture, just sharing information, neighbor to neighbor. Blackwell's not known for his restraint when crossed. Neither are we, Willis replied grimly. Now you and your men are. Welcome to water your horses at the creek. Take a meal at the way station if you've got coin to pay for it, but I suggest you move on before nightfall. Storm's coming from the north, and the high passes won't remain open much longer. It was a dismissal, polite but firm. The hunter recognized it as such, nodding slowly as he assessed the unified opposition before him. Appreciate the hospitality, he said, no attempt to mask the sarcasm in his tone. We'll water the horses and be on our way, but I expect we'll return in the spring, perhaps with Blackwell himself. His gaze swept the crowd once more. Might want to consider carefully who you're protecting and what it might cost you when the snow melts. With that parting shot, he wheeled his horse and led his companions toward the creek that ran along the settlement's western edge. The gathered residents remained in place, watching until the riders were out of earshot before breaking into murmured conversations. Jackson moved immediately to Eleanor's side, his expression grave. You heard? She nodded, her mouth dry with fear. Blackwell has a personal stake in finding me, beyond the bounty. Makes no sense, Jackson muttered, guiding her away from the dispersing crowd toward the relative privacy of the path leading back to her cabin. Unless your father doubled the reward without advertising it, or unless it isn't about the money at all, Eleanor said slowly, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind. What if Blackwell is one of the men named in the ledger? Jackson halted, the implications of her suggestion sinking in. A bounty hunter working for corrupt officials and businessmen. Perfect arrangement. He brings in anyone who threatens their operations, makes problems disappear legally. It would explain his reputation, his success, Eleanor agreed. The pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. And why is he so determined to find me specifically? It's not just about a murderer escaping justice. It's about silencing someone who can expose a wider conspiracy. Jackson's expression hardened. We need to check that ledger, now. They walked rapidly back to Eleanor's cabin, neither speaking until they were safely inside, with the door bolted behind them. Eleanor knelt beside the loose floorboard, prying it up to reveal the hidden compartment beneath. The leather-bound ledger lay where she had concealed it, untouched since their arrival in Haven. Benson's got lookouts established at 3 points along the western slope. First sign of Blackwell or his men will have warning before they reach the valley floor. Eleanor nodded, her mind already turning over the variables in their plan. So much depended on preparation, on anticipating Blackwell's likely approach and response, yet she knew from bitter experience that plans rarely survived first contact with reality. They would need to be adaptable, ready to improvise when circumstances inevitably changed. The trading post was warm after the biting cold outside, a fire crackling in the large stone hearth at its center. Willis had cleared the main counter, replacing the usual goods with Palmer's newly completed map, which was weighted at the corners with stones. Around it stood Benson, Palmer herself, and 2 brothers named Cartwright, former Army scouts who had found their way to Haven after disagreements with their commanding officers over the treatment of native tribes. "There you are," Willis greeted, his normally gruff demeanor softened slightly by months of close collaboration. Was beginning to think you'd fallen into a snowdrift. Just finishing some training, Jackson replied, moving to study the map. This is excellent work, Agnes. The older woman nodded, accepting the compliment with characteristic reserve. Drew, what I know. The eastern approaches might not be fully accurate. Haven't traveled that ridge myself in some years. The eastern route is the least likely approach, Benson observed. Too exposed, too difficult to navigate, especially with horses. Blackwell will come from the west, following the river valley. Most direct route from Silverton once the lower pass clears. Eleanor joined them at the map, noting the careful detail Palmer had included. The contours of the land, the dense forest that surrounded Haven on 3 sides, the meandering creek that provided both sustenance and a natural boundary to the north. We need to consider that Blackwell won't come alone, she said, giving voice to the concern that had occupied her thoughts increasingly as winter began to wane. The bounty hunters who came before, they mentioned he might join them in spring. That suggests he's gathering allies, planning a larger force. How many men can he realistically bring through the pass? Asked Samuel Cartwright, the elder of the brothers. His weathered face creased in thought. Supply considerations alone would limit the number. Blackwell's resourceful, Jackson replied. I'd expect no fewer than 8 men, possibly as many as 12, well-armed, experienced in this terrain. Benson whistled softly. Against our 7 trained fighters, not favorable odds. Which is why we don't meet them head-on, Eleanor interjected, her finger tracing a path on the map that they had discussed previously. We use the land itself as our ally, channel them where we want them to go. The box canyon, Willis nodded, following her reasoning. Narrow entrance, steep walls. Once they're inside, we control the only exit. Unless they spot the trap before. Entering, cautioned Nathan Cartwright, the younger brother whose caution balanced Samuel's more aggressive tendencies. Blackwell's no fool. He'll be suspicious of too convenient a situation. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Jackson. This was the most tenuous aspect of their plan, ensuring Blackwell and his men entered the canyon willingly, without sensing the ambush that awaited. That's where I come in, she said quietly. Blackwell wants me and the ledger. We give him a glimpse of exactly that, just enough to draw him in. A concerned murmur rose from the group. They had debated this point extensively over the winter, months, whether Eleanor should participate directly in the confrontation or remain safely hidden until the danger passed. Jackson had been particularly adamant that she stay clear of the fighting, a position she had consistently rejected. It's too risky, he said now, his voice low but intense. One wrong move, and you're in his hands. Everything we've planned falls apart, and without proper bait he'll never enter the canyon, Eleanor countered firmly. I won't be alone, won't be unprotected. But he needs to see me, needs to believe his search is finally over. The others watched this exchange with varying expressions, concern, respect, and in Willis's case, a knowing look that suggested he understood more about Eleanor and Jackson's relationship than either had openly acknowledged. She's right, Benson said finally, breaking the tension. Plan doesn't work unless Blackwell believes he's about to capture exactly what he came for. Can't fake that convincingly enough to fool a man of his experience. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he offered no further objection. They had circled this argument too many times over the winter months, neither willing to yield, but both recognizing the pragmatic truth of their situation. The final decision would be Eleanor's. It was her life at stake, her future hanging in the balance. We have time yet to refine the details, Agnes Palmer observed, her calm voice a balm to the group's evident tension. Snow's still deep in the high passes. According to Willis's barometer, we've another major storm approaching from the northwest. Earliest Blackwell could reach us is late March, more likely April. Willis nodded agreement. 4 to 6 weeks. To perfect our approach. Time enough to ensure everyone knows their role precisely. The discussion turned to practical matters. Ammunition supplies, positioning of lookouts, contingency plans if the initial strategy failed. Eleanor participated actively, her mind cataloguing details, identifying potential weaknesses, suggesting alternatives. The woman who had once deferred to men in all matters of consequence now spoke with authority, earned through months of preparation and years of surviving against impossible odds. As the meeting concluded and the group dispersed, Eleanor remained behind, studying Palmer's map with renewed focus. She traced the route Blackwell would likely take, visualizing each step of the confrontation that loomed on the horizon. Having second thoughts, Jackson asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. Eleanor shook her head. No, but I am considering every possible thing that could go wrong. She glanced up at him, a small smile touching her lips despite the gravity of their situation. As you once told me, survival depends on anticipating disaster before it arrives. Jackson leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed but his eyes serious as they studied her face. You've changed since Silverton. For better or worse? She asked, curious about his assessment. Just different, he replied thoughtfully. The woman I found hiding in that assayer's office wouldn't have suggested using herself as bait for a man like Blackwell. Wouldn't have spent months learning to throw knives and shoot straight. She wouldn't have survived this long, Eleanor acknowledged. Sometimes I barely recognize myself from before, the things that seemed important then. Boston society, fine dresses and proper manners. There was no mockery in Jackson's tone, only genuine interest. All of it. My father's. Approval. The respect of people who are measured worth by family name and bank accounts. Eleanor traced an idle pattern on the edge of the map. It feels like someone else's life now, a story I read once rather than my own past. Do you miss it? Jackson asked, watching her carefully. Eleanor considered the question seriously, wanting to give him a truthful answer rather than the easy dismissal that might be expected. Parts of it, she admitted finally. Music, books, conversations about ideas rather than just survival. But not the constraints, the constant awareness of boundaries I wasn't permitted to cross, not the person I was molded to be rather than the one I might have become on my own terms. Jackson nodded, understanding in his eyes. Haven's not Boston, never will be, but it has its own kind of freedom. Yes, Eleanor agreed softly. I've found that. A comfortable silence fell between them, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the empty trading post. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, large flakes drifting past the window in lazy spirals. There's something I've been meaning to ask, Jackson said finally, his tone casual, though Eleanor sensed an underlying tension in his posture. After this is over, after Blackwell, what then? It was a question Eleanor had carefully avoided examining too closely, focusing instead on the immediate challenge of survival. But now, with Jackson's steady gaze on her face, she found she could no longer defer consideration of the future. If we succeed, she began carefully, if the ledger reaches the right hands and the corruption is exposed, I don't know. My name won't be cleared. Jacob is still dead by my hand, regardless of the circumstances. But perhaps I could stop running, find somewhere to build a new life under a different name. Here, Jackson asked, the single word carrying more weight than its brevity suggested. Eleanor met his gaze directly. I've thought about it. Haven has become important to me. The people here, the life possible here. She hesitated, then added softly, some people here, in particular. Something shifted in Jackson's expression, a warming, a softening around the eyes that transformed his weathered features. Been thinking the same, he admitted. My claim near Silverton has good silver left in it, enough to support a comfortable life, if managed carefully. could split time between there and here, best of both worlds. The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to voice it explicitly, but both aware of its presence. Not just separate futures intersecting, occasionally, but a shared path forward. "I'd like that," Eleanor said simply, allowing herself to imagine such a possibility for the first time. A life not defined by flight or fear, but by choice and connection. Jackson's hand moved across the counter to cover hers briefly, a touch. So light it might have been accidental, if not for the intentionality in his gaze. "One step at a time," he said. "First, we deal with Blackwell. Then we can talk about what comes after." Eleanor nodded, turning her hand beneath his to intertwine their fingers momentarily before both withdrew, the brief contact leaving a warmth that lingered on her skin. Outside, the snow fell harder, adding another layer to the deep drifts that isolated Haven from the world beyond the mountains. But spring would come eventually, bringing with it both danger and possibility. Eleanor found she was ready for both. Later that evening, as she walked back to her cabin through the freshly fallen snow, Eleanor paused to look up at the vast sweep of stars visible in the clear mountain sky. The constellations were different here than in Boston, or perhaps she simply observed them differently, with eyes that had learned to truly see rather than merely glance. The woman who had stumbled through the desert outside Silverton, certain of her impending death, would not recognize the person who stood beneath these stars now. That Eleanor had been defined by what she was fleeing. This Eleanor was defined by what she was building, a new identity, a new community, the foundations of a future she had chosen rather than inherited. As she continued toward the warm light, shining from her cabin window, Eleanor allowed herself to acknowledge the truth that had been growing within her for months. Whatever happened when Blackwell arrived, whatever challenges still lay ahead, she had already found something precious. In these mountains, not merely sanctuary from her pursuers, but a sense of belonging she had never known before. Haven had lived up to its name. In this remote settlement of outcasts and wanderers, Eleanor Reed had finally come home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.